The ride quality is really nice. For those of you who are new to the channel, this is the OG crew cab. I built this truck from the ground up about 8 years ago, and this truck has been reliable as an ox. It owes me nothing. Over the past couple years, our main focus on this truck has been power in the Road to 600 series. We're shooting to get this to 600 horsepower, and we're currently at 502 horsepower. So we're still on that road, and we will continue. But in that process, along with taking multiple cross-country road trips in this truck, there's been a glaring issue that's become very obvious to me: drivability. So what does drivability mean? So this truck, being a first-gen Cummins technically, is coming up on 40 years old. They're very reliable, you can make a lot of power, but the suspension, that technology is a little dated by now. So drivability is really the comfort while you're driving, hitting bumps, going off-road, steering at high speeds, at low speeds, towing, things like that. So we've got a ton of parts to get installed. Let me give you a brief rundown on what these parts are. So from Archive Garage, we've got 52-inch front springs, we've got the front spring hanger, we've got new shackles, the rear shackle hangers, shock mounts, upper shock mounts, and then the support brackets for this that are factory in here, but we're replacing them with the Archive Garage ones. Then from Ruff Stuff Specialties, we have our crossover steering kit and our tie rod. So a 1-ton tie rod, crossover steering, all our tie rod ends, everything for that. And then from Accutune, we have brand new Fox 2.0 shocks that have been custom tuned for this truck, for all the specs of the truck, the weight, the suspension setup we're going with, the spring rate of the springs. Should be a really custom, cool setup. So in order to focus on the ride quality, we're going to do a couple videos working on this truck. We're going to focus on the suspension, the brakes, the steering, anything we can do to help this thing ride and drive better. So I have a question for you guys, seasoned mechanics, maybe not, but this nut is really stuck into this socket. I kind of had to hammer it to get it on there. How do you guys get those out? I tried threading it back on, couldn't pull it off because it's so stuck in there. This is my method, but I'm not sure it's the easiest one. I just stick a screwdriver in there and keep dropping it until it comes out. She's coming. There we go. That's my method. Is there a better method out there? Let me know, because that doesn't seem to be the most efficient, but it does work. All right, so we've got our truck jacked up a little differently. So I've got these 6-ton stands under the frame here. And what I did was I jacked the truck way up, put those under, then I let the axle fall down, and I've got the axle under these other jack stands. We've got all our U-bolts taken off, got our shocks taken off. So we're basically ready to lower the axle out just a little bit. So we've got both our leaf springs out. That was not super hard at all. And then now we are to grinding a bunch of rivets. So this piece I've already taken out there. There were 3 rivets. So the instructions go over really well which rivets, and I've showed how to grind rivets out on my channel before. I'll show you here again so you can have a reminder, but we got to get this thing out on the other side, and then a bunch of rivets out right here. So just a lot of grinding rivets. It's fun stuff. Also, the instructions didn't say you need to take the exhaust out to get this piece out. It would be way easier if you didn't have an exhaust in there. I was actually able to finagle it out of there without taking the exhaust out, and I'm hoping I'll be able to get the new one in there without taking it out either. I hate taking the exhaust out. So here's your quick reminder on how to grind the rivets out. So here's the 3 we're going to take out. What I do is I get my grinder, I grind 1 straight line, 2 right in the middle, and 3 right over here. And then I get my air chisel, it's laying somewhere over there with the spade bit, and come parallel to those lines and just push the head off. Then you might have to grind the surface down just a little bit, but then you use the air chisel with the punch bit and push it right through. That's the easiest way I found to remove these. So I got a lot of the rivets out with the grinder and the air hammer, but there's a few in here that you can't get a grinder in there. So I did this on the other side and it worked really well. I've got 5 drill bits going from really tiny up to 1/2 inch. So I center punch the rivet, then I start with the smallest one, drill it all the way, not all the way through, but through to where the head is mushroomed out. Then I do the next one, and as soon as you get the 1/2 inch through there, air chisel the head right off and it comes right off. It's actually pretty slick. So and I just do 1 rivet at a time so I can let the bits cool down. Just like that, pops right off. So we've got our old spring hangers taken off. It's time to start mounting the new ones. We're gonna start here in the back. There's a hole where the spring perch comes through, where the bushing comes through. And these are the mounts that come from Archive Garage. But if you check the hole, it needs to be reamed out just a little bit to fit. And that's in the instructions as well. This is one of the only kits that you can fit one of the nice big size bushings on these springs and still maintain a stock hole in the frame without having to mount a jig up to it and drill a whole new hole there. So let's ream that out. I've got a bit on my Dremel, and then we'll mount this right up. Perfect. So this side is a little more challenging, again, because of the exhaust. This would be easier if I would just take the exhaust out, but I'm this far into it. I'm gonna see what I can do. So the bolt was too long, it was hitting the exhaust, so I trimmed it down, trying to make enough room for the nut to fit in there. So I've got the exhaust on a ratchet strap. There we go. Oh, yep, we're gonna work. We have engagement. So unfortunately the exhaust is gonna hit that nut. I don't know how it was when it was stock. I don't know if it was hitting it or what, but not a big deal. The exhaust is so tight in some of these spots, so we'll just get it in and then we'll move to the front. Oh, shit. Well, I did all that and I put them on backwards. There's a little curve here and I think the curve is supposed to kick out back. So let's undo it.
1 minute, 37 seconds later.
Never mind. I just checked the instructions. The curve is supposed to go forward, so we're good. Tighten her back up. And we'll torque it down to spec once we get the springs in and stuff so these don't move. All right, our front frame hanger is in. That, again, it's not difficult, just kind of a pain, lots of bolts, but that's a good thing. Keep it up there nice and solid. Got it torqued down. All the torque specs come with the instructions per, what size bolt. So we're ready to put our springs in, but I just want to make sure we need to put some perches on for the shocks, and I have to weld them onto the axle. And I'm thinking it's gonna be easier to do that now without the springs in. So let's check that out, and then we'll get the springs in and steering in and tie rod and shocks, and we'll be done. That's all. So we're going to be upgrading our upper shock mounts and lower shock mounts. Here's the new lower one that we've got. So we need to cut these old ones off with our grinder, get them cut off, cleaned up, and then we can weld these ones on. And that way, that's all taken care of without the spring being in here. So I think that'll be much more convenient without a spring in the way. All right, so I got the old one out. So this is the new one. One thing I do want to do first though, before we weld this on, this new one sticks out further than the old one. So I'm going to take the tie rod off so we can turn the knuckle and make sure that this doesn't hit the knuckle at full lock to the right. So, but that was a pain to get that old one off, but we got it off with a grinder. You can do it with tools you have. So the other one's going to be way easier because the pumpkin isn't so close. So let's get the tie rod off and make sure we don't have any contact. All right, the tie rod is off. So I'm going to try and get this as wide out as I can, which is going to come right up against here. And it looks like we're clear. There's about a 1/2 inch between the knuckle and the bracket, which means the head's going to clear for sure. It's going to be close, but it's going to clear. So we're good. We are good. So I got the lower shock mount just tacked in. And so I want to get the upper shock mount in a little bit so I can somewhat test fit the shock just to make sure we've got it how we want it. Okay, so again, we're running these Fox 2.0s and they're custom tuned for this truck. And that does look about perfect. All right, little change of plans because I started to think about this. I don't want to weld the lower shock bracket in until we've got the truck sitting on the springs, sitting on the tires, so we can see what height it sits at, and then we can make sure that the lower bracket is oriented as far as up and down perfectly to have the right travel of the shock. So it should be probably about midway of the travel when it's at rest and parked. So I'm going to cut the other one off, get that one done, and then we'll get our tie rod and our steering stuff taken care of. But I'm glad I thought of that because I measured the shock just now and it seemed right, but then I realized this may not be the height it's going to be at. Okay, I've got the other shock mount off, all ground down, nice and pretty. I've got the tie rod off, still have the steering hooked up. So I think what I'm going to do is take the steering shaft off and then put the springs in so we can get the springs in, get some weight on it. Once the springs are in, we can do our crossover steering and our tie rod, and then we can weld our shock mounts onto the axle once we know where the truck is going to sit fully loaded. I don't know what I'm doing. I'm just kind of going with what I can figure out. Let's try that. All right, I got the springs in. They are awesome. It really wasn't too bad, but you saw I kind of struggled. This axle fell off the jack. So again, I really don't know what order I should be doing this in, but I'm thinking what I'm going to do now, put some U-bolts and get the spring secured to the axle, put the tie rod on, then put the wheels and tires on, then let it down onto the wheels and tires, take measurements for the shock perches, then put those on. I don't know, I think that's what we're gonna do, but let's try it. It'll work. So one thing we have to do as part of the crossover steering setup, we've got to take our steering gearbox off and move it from the four-wheel drive position to the two-wheel drive position. So the four-wheel drive position uses this plate thing that I'm sure a lot of you know about. Let me pull it off, I'll show you the plate, and then I'll show you the holes where the two-wheel drive position is. We're also going to have to pull our pitman arm and face it up this way so that when we turn, it's going crossover steering, I guess is the best way to think of it. So let me get this off and I'll show you that plate and show you where that two-wheel drive position is. So the gearbox bolts on with these 4 bolts right there. It's got this bracket that the bolts go through. So we got to undo these, get this plate off. This is what the plate looks like right here, just like that. It goes on like that. So we take that off and then the gearbox is going to sit right against the frame, and these bolts will go through the frame straight into the box. So here's the 3 holes where that bracket was mounted for the four-wheel drive position. Now for the two-wheel drive position, we just have these 4 holes right here. The bolts will come straight through and bolt right into the gearbox. So let's get that mounted up. Well, I ran into my first little snag. Tried to put the pitman arm on and it's completely hitting the sway bar. Did some research on the forums a little bit, talked to Charlie Pitcher, talked to Eric at Archive Garage. The consensus is to run crossover steering like this, we got to remove the sway bar. So that's not what I wanted to do, but we're going to do that for now. Down the road, I'll try and figure out a solution to maybe get one back in here. But I think the upgrade in steering will outweigh the loss in stability, and even a lot of people say it's better without the sway bar, that the suspension doesn't feel so rigid. So we'll take it off, get our pitman arm on, and get our crossover steering in. All right, we got our sway bar out. That's super easy to take out. I got my power steering lines hooked back up to the gearbox, and I mocked up the pitman arm. And if you can see from that angle, this is not going to work, this pitman arm. It's going to cut right through this cross member. So did some research. I talked to Eric at Archive Garage, talked to Charlie Pitcher, and all of them have the same consensus, even on the forums. We need a two-wheel drive pitman arm. Now, lucky enough, I just happen to have a two-wheel drive donor truck back here, and I actually wanted to use the steering setup as it is stock, but we'll rob this pitman arm off, and you can see it's a little longer and it doesn't curve back up. So we're going to steal this pitman arm. We'll find another one for once we get this chassis ready to go, but luckily we've got one on hand. All right, we got our two-wheel drive one taken off, got it cleaned up nicely. So here's the four-wheel drive one. There's the two-wheel drive one. Throw it on there. Yeah, and now the rod can go right through this cross member. So there we go. The more you know, I guess. You have to do that two-wheel drive pitman arm for crossover steering, or you could probably just get a drop arm from somewhere, but two-wheel drive one's cheap. All right, now we need to pull a measurement from this bracket, 42 inches. And our rod ends are adjustable by a couple inches, so it just has to be close. So let's make up our steering bar. So some of the crossover steering manufacturers I've seen have a bend in this steering bar. It looks close, like I'm gonna see once the suspension squishes how we're doing, but if we have to, I'll pull it out, cut a pie cut, and kind of radius a little bend in there, but for now, looks pretty good. All right, so we've got our crossover steering in, our tie rod. None of these are torqued down. The pitman arm's not torqued down yet because we're gonna now raise the axle up, put the wheels on, figure out where our lower shock towers need to go, get that all welded in. Then once we check that everything looks good, I'm actually going to pull these and paint them, and so not going to torque them down quite yet. So let's get our shocks in, and that'll be the last thing before we kind of disassemble, paint things, and put it all back together and go take it for a rip. All right, so we got the truck on the tires, complete load of the truck onto the suspension. Just by doing some math with our shocks, I need them to be at resting length, 21.5 from eye to eye. Now I did a little math to figure that out. Basically I wanted 5.25 inches of the, the bar that goes into the shock. I needed that much exposed. So I just did that, 21.5. So we're just gonna take a tape measure down, measure from the top eye to this eye, 21.5, tack it on, and then probably just weld it on. It should be pretty easy. Okay, measurement looks good. I'm just gonna weld it in there. All right, here is a look from the side. The front is at least level with the rear. It might be a little taller, which is okay because these springs will settle and then it'll be perfect. Got the shock tower tabs welded in there. So I'm just letting those cool before I paint them, and then we can put the shocks in. I really think I'm going to have to pull this steering bar out and add a bend to it. There is about 1/4 inch between it and the cross member, which means if this side of the axle goes up at all, it's going to hit that cross member. So I'll probably have to take it out, add some type of bend to it, but that shouldn't be too hard. All right, here it is. See if you can see. Way more clearance. We're 1.5 to 2 inches of clearance under the cross member now. You can see it come across there. And there's our S-curve. Pretty nice if I do say so myself. Now we do still have to tighten down the castle nuts, but that looks pretty good. All right, I also got our custom Accutune Fox 2.0 performance shocks in. I unfortunately did not film that, but there just was not a good way to get a camera in here. The way I found that worked the best was put the bottom in, then the top would be up here, and then you come up from the top, pull it down, slide it in there, and then you can finagle that bolt in there. It was kind of a pain in the butt, but as with everything we do on these trucks, it's doable. So those look really, really good. I might end up having to trim this because I don't want the braided line to touch on that metal edge, but looks really good. All right, we got everything installed. That took me a couple days, not full days, but it was a lot of work, but we got it all done. I just need to grease up all the tie rod ends for the tie rod and the steering shaft, and bleed the power steering, and then we can take this thing for a drive. All right, let's go test it. I've got the GoPro down underneath. Oh yeah. So just pulling out of the driveway where it's a little bit of a bump, usually the front hits really hard when it comes off of there. This time it just, the way I describe it is it hits down and then just slowly, like you can feel those shocks and the springs really absorbing it. So the springs absorb coming down and then the shocks nice and slowly let it back up. No bouncing or anything, very smooth. Okay, I'm noticing something interesting. There is a lot of play in the steering wheel when I'm going just straight. Let me see if I can show you guys this. So going straight, that's pretty much all play. So I would not expect that with the crossover steering. I don't know what the issue is there, but maybe the steering gearbox. So we'll check that out. But the ride quality is really nice. I'm actually pretty shocked how nice it rides for a leaf sprung truck. Now it's the rear especially that just is pretty hard. I'll hit a bump right here. Yeah, the front just, that's crazy. The front just absorbs it, one little bump and it's soft. Man, that's awesome. This will be really cool to compare to Charlie's 3-link suspension. I mean, I'm sure the 3-link's gonna outperform this as far as, you know, ride quality, but for being leaf sprung and a little bit cheaper of a route to go, this is really, really good. So I'll let you look underneath at the suspension. Okay, this street's usually pretty bumpy. Yeah, now the rear stands out that it needs some work, so, but the front is awesome. Now it's still an old truck, it's still leaf sprung, so don't get your hopes up that this is gonna drive like a 2023 truck, but it is way better. But this steering issue is weird. So I'm gonna make some calls and see what we need to do to figure that out. Let me know if you have any ideas in the comments, and we'll try and figure that out. Well guys, that was a ton of work, but just from driving it a couple days in a row now, it was worth it. The ride quality is awesome. Archive Garage, Ruff Stuff Specialties, and Accutune, those shocks turned out amazing. But as you saw in our little test drive, we still have an issue. I've talked to Charlie about it. We know what the problem is, but this video is too long so far. We're actually gonna fix that in the next video, so stay tuned for that. Thank you for your support, and we'll see you guys in the next one.